So I want to start by telling you a story. And the story comes from, in some sense, two sets of data, two sources. And the first source comes from listening to boys for the last almost 30 years at this point, doing research. I'm a developmental psychologist, listening to young boys and girls as well, but today I'm going to focus on the boys. Since the late 80s. Looking at their what's called in developmental psychology, their social and emotional development. And the boys told me a story. I followed them over many years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the same boys, hundreds of boys over the last 30 years. And the boys have been telling me a story about who we are as human, what disrupts our humanity, the consequences of that disruption, and how do we begin to fix it. And then what I began to realize after listening to boys for so long and trying to tell this story, and the story is in my book, Deep Secrets, is that the science, the larger body of science, was telling the same story. It was saying that, when I say the larger body of science, I mean neuroscience, the natural social sciences, the health sciences, as well as obviously practice and the arts. We're telling the same story about essentially who we are as human, what disrupts our humanity, the consequences of that disruption, and then the ways to solve it. In the developmental story, the story of the boys, I also have to, of course, mention the girls' work, which the girls' work actually is the inspiration for the boys' work. And so one story, to make it clear, is a developmental story that includes boys and girls, and what boys and girls have been telling us through the work of Carol Gilligan, Lynn Michael Brown, Deb Tolman, lots of wonderful researchers looking at girls in particular. What the girls' work and the boys' work, my work, Michael Kimmel's work, Michael Riker, Gary Barker, Pedro Noguera, have all been saying in that, what I would call developmental work, the story of growing up. Essentially, this is the developmental story. You grow up, you're born human, with all your full human capacities, and then when you grow up in a dehumanized culture, which is our modern capitalist culture, it distorts our humanity and leads to great problems, which we're seeing in violence and suicide and all sorts of chaos we're seeing around the world. So what does it mean to grow up in a dehumanizing culture? Is the story really coming from young people? The other story of a larger science I'll briefly discuss when we get there, but it repeats a similar story. So my work is on, just to give you the details for all of you researchers in the room, it's on hundreds of boys. It's mostly boys from New York City and Boston, but some boys we do studies in Nanjing, China, and in Delhi, India. So it draws across the board from boys all over the place. And I want to tell you a story about how they talked about their friendships, which again links to this larger story about who we are as human, what disrupts our humanity, and how do we fix it. So I'm going to start off with quotes from boys. Each quote that I said that I read is a different boy, and I want you to just listen and hear them. So boys' friendships during early adolescence, this is what it sounds like to listen to boys talking about their friendships. My best friend and I love each other. That's it. You have this thing that is deep, so deep, it's within you. You can't explain it. It's just a thing that you know that person is that person, and that is all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes two people can really, really understand each other and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens. It's human nature. And that's a quote from Justin at 14 years old, where he basically, the quality of that quote is heard in about 85% of the boys I speak with at ages 11, 12, 13, 14, which is they're very emotionally articulate, astute, wanting close friendships, wanting intimate friendships, sometimes having them, oftentimes wanting them, and not necessarily finding other boys that they can really share their deep secrets. Another boy said, I've got two best friends, Willie and Brian. Like sometimes when me and Willie argue, me and Brian are real close. Then when me and Brian are not doing so good, me and Willie are real close. It's like circles of love. Sometimes we're all close. My ideal best friend is a close friend who I could say anything to, because sometimes you need to spill your heart out to somebody, and if there's nobody there, then you're going to keep it inside, then you will have anger, so you need somebody to talk to always. And again, 85% of the boys, hundreds and hundreds of boys, sound like this. And one of the things that's important to say is they're not only revealing their desire for intimacy, but also the consequences when they don't have it, right? You know, on that Christmas day, my friends and I all slept in this little bed. It was little. We were like squeezing, and then we were listening to this cheap radio. My friend got a cheap radio. We were turning it like a low volume and listening to songs at like 12:30 at night till like 3 in the morning. We were not all listening. We were talking about secrets, and that's how I know my best friends. What I like most about my best friendship is the connection. It's like, you know how you know somebody for so long, you could talk about anything, and you won't even think, oh, what are they thinking? You just talk. Yeah, because my best friend is like a second person you could speak to. It's like, see how the kids carry a little teddy bear or whatever, and when they cry, they'll hold it and stuff. So when you like get upset or something, you just walk over to your closest friends, and they'll loosen you up, whatever. They'll be like, yeah, it's all right, even though it's not. The last set of quotes in early adolescence, the last set, I want you to pay attention to, particularly this is now talking about the consequences if they don't have that intimacy. Okay, so boys are telling this directly, and you'll see it being picked up in the larger body of science in a moment. You need friends to talk to you sometimes, you know, like you have nobody to talk to, you don't have a friend, it's hard. You got to keep things bottled up inside. You might just start crying or whatever, like if a family is beating on you or something, and you can't tell a friend, you might just go out, just, you know, do drugs, sell drugs, whatever. Friends are important because, like, if you have problems with something, you go talk to him. By the way, I just want to make sure you hear that it's a him. You know, if you keep it all to yourself, you go crazy, try to take it out on somebody else. Without friends, you will go crazy or mad. You'd be lonely all the time, be depressed. You would go wacko. My friendships are important because you need a friend or else you'd be depressed, you won't be happy. You'd try to kill yourself because then you'd be all alone and no one to talk to. So this is what boys sound like in early adolescence when they talk about their friends, both their desire and then the consequences if they don't have those kinds of close connections that they want. Now, as boys move into late adolescence, you can imagine the story begins to shift. As they become the expectations of manhood in this culture, in American culture in particular today, I'm focusing on, the expectations to become a man means, guess what? It means losing that emotional sensitivity and vulnerability because so-called in our culture, that's not manly. So this is what they sound like when you ask the very same questions about their friendships by the time they're 16 and 17. I don't care, whatever. No homo. You start to hear no homo constantly. I don't have best friends who are guys, I'm not gay. So all of a sudden the equation of sexuality and intimacy comes into play. That's a very American phenomenon, a late 20th century American phenomenon that we equate intimacy and male friendship with a sexuality that didn't occur in the late 19th century. In fact, best friends were oftentimes taken, for middle class couples, were taken on honeymoons in the 19th century. No, I don't say I have a male best friend because I feel that a friend is going to be there for you and he'll support you and stuff like that. Whether they're good and bad times, you share with them, you could share your feelings with him, your true feelings. That's why I don't think I have any real close friends. Yeah, basically, I hate it. Because, you know, I wouldn't mind talking to somebody my age that I can relate to him on a different basis. And I threw that quote in because I wanted to underscore that some of the boys sort of checked out in the, it doesn't matter, I don't care, I'm not gay, I don't have close friendships. But other boys actually were still able to articulate the desire and the loss and the sadness around the loss. And I'll talk about it later, but to me and to the researchers that study this, that's a kind of resistance. They're holding on to their feelings and their sense of their loss, and they're not just pretending to not care. And that I don't care, which we'll talk about in a moment, is what a lot of American culture is now consumed with, because caring in this culture is lame. The research with the boys and the girls reveal what it means to be human, as I said before, the capacity for love. It reveals what disrupts our humanity, masculinity, stereotypes about gender, race, sexuality, all those things that we actually believe in as a culture that actually divide us and to create a hierarchy where men are on top, white people are on top, rich people are on top, and the other people who aren't that are on the bottom. And this is the strange part about the way we create those hierarchies, is actually both people in the hierarchy suffer. Because the premise of being on the top, guess what the premise of being on the top is? That you shouldn't show the qualities on the bottom. And if you can't show the qualities on the bottoms, and what's the qualities on the bottoms? Vulnerability, sensitivity, intimacy, relationships, those are the qualities on the bottom. And if you can't show those qualities, guess what that means? That means you're only half human, and if you're only half human, you're not human at all. So the idea that you're premised to be on the top, you can't be on the bottom, means that you deny most of, if not all of your humanity. So the division, the hierarchy that we have, is bad for everybody. And the consequences, boys talk about the mental health consequences, and I do have to add that right at the age that boys start to disconnect from their friendships and start to, their vulnerable language leaves their stories, is right at the time the suicide rate for boys across the country rises to 5 times the rate of girls. And so it's right at that moment that you hear the boys disconnect from their own humanity, and then you hear these huge rates of both violence, self-directed and other directed violence. The strategy is to reconnect, and that's about resisting dehumanization, resisting disconnection in a disconnected culture. So now looking to the larger science story, this is the second story I'm telling you. That was the developmental story, listening to young people. And what you'll hear in the larger body of science over the past 10 years, the same story is being told. But we can't hear that story unless we heard the young people. We can't put it together as a story unless we heard the young people tell it developmentally. Okay, so the story from the science, what do we know about what it means to be human? There's an abundance of books that have come out in the last decade. The Age of Empathy, Roots of Empathy, Wired for Love, Wired for Care, Social, Connected, all sorts of books that talk about this phenomenon, that we're now moving away from a notion that humans are simply greedy bastards, and actually showing that in fact we're deeply emotional social creatures, and that's a huge reason why we've actually thrived as a species, according to Darwin, in fact. From Matt Lieberman, a quote is, he's a neuroscientist, he says, "We are wired to be social. We are driven by deep motivations to stay connected to friends and family. We are naturally curious about what is going on in the minds of other people. We spend our entire lives motivated by social connection." Sarah Hrdy, an evolutionary anthropologist, says, "From a tender age and without special training, modern humans identify with the plights of others and without being asked, volunteer to help and share, even with strangers. In this respect, our line of apes is a class by itself. This ability to identify with others and vicariously experience their suffering is not simply learned, it is part of us." And finally, Franz de Waal, a primatologist, "We involuntarily enter the bodies of those around us so that their movements and emotions echo within us as if they are our own from the beginning of life. This is our humanity." These are quotes underscoring our humanity, just like the boys did when they talked about their friendships in early adolescence. This is a huge body of science. I'm citing now hundreds and hundreds of studies. "Our default position in our brain is in social mode. Our social well-being significantly shapes our mental, physical, and cognitive health. Our relational context significantly influences our visual, auditory, and sensory perceptions." And I have dozens and dozens of examples of what I mean by that, but I'm not going to give that today. So the second part of the story, what disrupts our humanity according to the science, again, the larger body of science. Again, back to mainstream masculinity. The boys already told us about that. But you see it in all sorts of work, and we're going to hear about the work today from Michael Kimmel in particular. Dehumanizing stereotypes about gender, race, sexuality, class, religion, and nationality. These, again, that hierarchy I was referring to, that's in the science, that's in social psychology, health psychology, sociology, all sorts of ways. They show that's what's disrupting our basic core capacity to love. And then a privileging of the self over relationships, or the individual over the collective. And that is so, you see that everywhere. A New York Times article started the other day on Sunday from the president of the American Enterprise Institute. He said, he started the article saying, "Are you an individualist or a conformist?" Right? So that's suggesting that somehow to conform, to be a group, to be a collective is negative. And so it's the wrong question, basically. A privileging of difference over commonality, and that's a complicated topic, because what we've oftentimes done in the study of culture and context is emphasize simply the difference. And what we've learned from PACH and from the listening to boys and girls is if you start from a place of difference, it's much harder to recognize the commonality. So it's not about denying the difference, it's about starting from a common place and then understanding within that common place to have a conversation about difference. As a culture, we're focused on difference, and if you think about it, why? In part, it has to do with all sorts of history of colonization and wanting to make sure our voices are heard, but it also comes from the idealization of exceptionalism and being exceptional and unique and special as a positive quality in this culture, rather than actually being like your brothers and sisters, loving human beings and being quite common with each other. Just in case you wondered and needed proof that we are still in a radically dehumanizing culture, Kim just pulled out images that you see on Facebook, and I want you to be aware, for all you parents in the room, of the kinds of images that are presented on Facebook, and the brutality of our culture. This is "Black woman is chair." And this I put up there, this was a criticism that we have of the way we pathologize mother and son relationships. And this is coming from the Bates Motel, which is a horror film, and it's premised on the horrible, mother-son relationship that's frightening to our culture. And I put this up because I wanted to emphasize also the American individualism. So we see this image as the image of success, right? That's our image of success, Steve Jobs from Apple, when it's really this. It was Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak who created Apple. And we rarely see that image, which is that basically success comes from collective work. It comes from being with some other people and developing things together. It never comes by yourself. But we present it as an individual quality. We see the consequences of our dehumanized global culture in all sorts of ways. Right, just like we heard it from the boys, you would go wacko if you don't have this core human connections. You see it in the data across the globe. Global suicide rates have increased by 60% over the past 45 years. The airplane pilot at the German Wings is one more example of it. More people in the US now die of suicide than in car accidents. Currently in the US, there's an incidence of mass violence occurring at the rate of approximately 1 every 2 weeks. It used to be two or three times a decade. It's now once every 2 weeks that we see incidents of mass violence, which is 4 more people being shot at the same incident. More than 1 in 3 women globally report having experienced physical or sexual partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner. And of course it varies by country, but that's globally. The percentage of adults who report having no close friends at all in the United States has increased from 36% in 1985 to 53% by 2004. 1 out of every 3 adults in the US over the ages of 45 report feeling lonely versus 1 out of every 5 adults 10 years ago. Empathy, the amount of time one spends thinking about another person's feelings in college students, has decreased by 40% since 1980. And finally, in massive studies they've done of industrialized countries, 30 industrialized countries, societies that value economic productivity over social equality or value independence over friendships have higher rates of depression, violent crime, and addiction. So you see the link. And then finally, this is a health-based research finding. Social isolation weakens our immune system and makes us more susceptible to diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and cancer, and to dying from these diseases as well. There's a 91% greater likelihood of survival from various types of diseases among those with strong social networks compared to those with weak social networks. And finally, the risk of death for those with poor social networks are comparable to smoking and excessive alcohol consumption and exceed the influence of obesity. So being socially isolated kills us. Strategies to reconnect, resistance to dehumanization, we'll talk more about that throughout the day, holding on to what we know about ourselves and about each other. Thick love, which is basically fostering the resistance, right? When you thickly love your child or you thickly love your student, it's listening to them, taking them seriously, allowing them to hold on to their humanity, allowing them to express their natural curiosity. Crossing silos, having the boys researchers talk to the girls researchers, talk to the researchers that study race, that study sexuality, that study religion, etc. We have to start crossing silos because ultimately the problems, we share common problems in terms of why we're in such a dehumanized place right now. Crossing borders, I mean by national borders, but I also mean religious borders. The biggest fight we're seeing right now globally, of course, is across religious lines. Challenging stereotypes, that's an obvious. And then forming a collective of resistors, which is what we attempt to do at PACH. And finally, my last slide, quickly, the aims of PACH is to integrate the knowledge of our common humanity, to communicate that framework to the general public, to generate new knowledge about our humanity and ways to resist disconnection, and to apply the PACH framework in schools, workplaces, and communities. And we'll be doing that in all sorts of ways, and we'll talk about it throughout the day. Okay, thank you to Novo Foundation, and again to Kim Wynn and everybody who's helped us out. Thank you very much.